It took Secretary of State Marco Rubio exactly 26 minutes to tear through one of the most aggressively manufactured political brands in modern American politics, and he did not need leaked documents, anonymous sources, secret recordings, or some dramatic last minute witness to do it. He used public records, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez's own financial disclosures, documented political history, and one worn photograph of his immigrant parents that had been sitting quietly inside his jacket pocket while she spent 15 minutes attacking the authenticity of his life. AOC should have understood the danger the moment she dismissed Rubio's family story as branding, because attacking policy is one thing. Attacking the lived history of a bartender's son and a hotel maid's son is something entirely different when that son has spent decades learning how to answer attacks with facts instead of theatrics. She should have recognized what was happening when Rubio refused to interrupt her, refused to perform outrage for the cameras, refused to give her staff the angry reaction shot they clearly wanted, and simply sat there making small notes while she kept pushing farther. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez smiled toward her staff, apparently expecting another viral confrontation, another triumphant headline, another clip packaged for social media, without realizing that Marco Rubio had come prepared to turn the entire argument back on the person delivering it. The House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing had been called for what was supposed to be routine testimony on American diplomatic priorities, the kind of hearing Washington conducts constantly without producing anything memorable beyond policy language and procedural exchanges. Cameras from the major networks were positioned throughout the room. C-SPAN carried multiple feeds. The gallery was unusually packed, and the audience looked younger than the typical congressional crowd, with more phones pointed toward the dais than notebooks resting on laps. That atmosphere mattered because almost everyone in the room seemed to expect confrontation rather than ordinary oversight. And the moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez received her questioning time, that expectation immediately became reality. The first hour had been conventional, with members asking about China, NATO, Middle Eastern diplomacy, and other foreign policy questions, while Rubio answered with the controlled precision of a longtime senator who had spent years working on international affairs before becoming Secretary of State. Then the chairman recognized Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and instead of using the time primarily to question Rubio, she launched into the kind of extended political prosecution that had become central to her national image. She attacked Rubio as a former moderate Republican who had once supported immigration reform but now served an administration she accused of separating families at the border, framing the change as proof that he had abandoned principles for political power. She moved directly from policy into biography, saying that Rubio talked constantly about the American dream while having attended elite law schools, married into connections, and used his personal story as a vehicle for advancement. Then came the word that changed the temperature of the hearing: branding, a deliberate attempt to reduce Rubio's family history from lived experience into political marketing. AOC followed by raising the Washington Post reporting about the timeline of Rubio's parents leaving Cuba, emphasizing that they arrived in 1956, before Fidel Castro took power, rather than after the revolution, and using that discrepancy to attack the credibility of Rubio's broader immigrant narrative. By the time she reached the claim that she represented the Bronx and therefore understood what struggle actually looked like, she was no longer simply challenging Marco Rubio's policies. She was presenting herself as the authentic voice of working-class hardship while positioning him as someone who had supposedly forgotten where he came from. Rubio did not interrupt her once, and that silence became more important with every passing minute because AOC was giving him a complete record of the argument he was about to dismantle. He sat at the witness table with a single sheet of paper rather than a theatrical stack of binders, making short notes in careful handwriting while maintaining eye contact and allowing every accusation to remain fully exposed. Behind AOC, Staff members had phones aimed toward Rubio, apparently waiting for the moment when he would become angry, defensive, irritated, or flustered enough to provide the reaction footage needed for the next viral headline. When AOC declared that she represented the Bronx, Rubio briefly smiled, not broadly and not theatrically, but just enough to suggest that he had heard exactly the statement he had been waiting for. She finished, folded back into her seat, crossed her arms, and let the silence hang for several seconds, evidently confident that she had just delivered the attack everyone had come to see. Then Rubio began quietly, and the entire structure of the exchange changed because he did not start by defending his government title, his voting record, or his political career. He started with his father, Mario Rubio, who worked as a bartender in Miami for 30 years, standing behind a bar, serving people who often never learned his name, doing ordinary physical work for ordinary pay, without television cameras waiting to celebrate him. He spoke about his mother, Oriales, who worked as a hotel maid, cleaned rooms, changed sheets, scrubbed bathrooms, rode the bus because the family could not afford another car, and came home carrying the physical cost of labor that rarely receives applause. His parents arrived from Cuba in 1956 without English, political connections, inherited wealth, elite networks, or any of the advantages that political rhetoric often pretends do not matter until somebody actually has to live without them. Their opportunity was not created through a slogan, a viral post, or a carefully polished identity, but through years of work performed largely outside the attention of people who would later use the language of struggle as a political credential. Then Rubio turned directly toward Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because once she had chosen biography as the battlefield, her own biography was no longer protected territory. He reminded the room that AOC had built enormous political capital around the phrase "girl from the Bronx," repeating the geography across speeches, campaign messaging, interviews, and social media until the location itself became part of her national identity. Rubio acknowledged that she was born in the Bronx, but then introduced the fact that disrupted the simplicity of the brand. She left the Bronx when she was 5 years old and moved with her family to Yorktown Heights in Westchester County. Yorktown Heights was not the struggling urban environment implied by the political shorthand that had followed her career. Rubio cited a median household income of roughly $138,000 and pointed to Yorktown High School, the suburban school she attended. He also brought up the yearbook history in which classmates knew her as Sandy Cortez, a detail that had already been publicly highlighted by New York Assemblyman Matt Slater, who attended the same school and openly mocked what he called the mythology surrounding AOC's Bronx identity. The contrast was becoming brutal because Rubio was not merely saying that AOC had lived in Westchester, he was placing that fact directly beside the working class biography she had just attempted to use against him. His mother cleaned hotel rooms in Miami, while AOC's mother, according to the account Rubio presented, cleaned tutors' homes in exchange for SAT preparation, and Rubio's point was not that either woman's labor lacked dignity, but that the circumstances AOC had tried to equate were plainly not identical. He sharpened the contrast further by describing his upbringing in a neighborhood where violent crime was a real presence, while describing her suburban environment as one in which homes reached hundreds of thousands of dollars and civic disputes centered on far more ordinary suburban concerns. AOC attempted to respond that she had always been transparent about growing up between the Bronx and Yorktown, but the problem Rubio was exposing was not whether Yorktown had ever appeared somewhere in her biography. The problem was that the phrase "from the Bronx" had been politically amplified for years because it carried a cultural and economic meaning much more useful than saying she spent most of her childhood growing up in suburban Westchester. Rubio then returned to the Washington Post, reporting she had used against him, and this was where the attack became less emotional and more methodical. His parents had indeed arrived in the United States in 1956, before Castro officially took power, And Rubio emphasized that when the timeline was challenged, he acknowledged and addressed the discrepancy instead of pretending the reporting did not exist. That distinction allowed him to establish the central accusation he was building. A real personal history can survive correction because the foundation remains intact even when a date, assumption, or family recollection needs clarification. He argued that AOC reacted differently when critics emphasized Yorktown Heights, treating scrutiny of the political image as an illegitimate attack rather than confronting the difference between being born in the Bronx and building an entire public identity around having grown up there. In only a few minutes, the hearing had moved from AOC attacking Rubio's immigrant story to Rubio forcing the room to examine whether the loudest claims about authenticity were coming from the person with the weakest claim to unquestioned authenticity. Rubio did not stay on biography for long because once he had established the difference between lived experience and political branding, he moved immediately into the record AOC had built while claiming to represent working people. In 2018, Amazon announced plans for a second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, a project tied to 25,000 jobs, an average salary of roughly $150,000, and an estimated $12 billion in economic activity flowing through the surrounding community. AOC opposed the deal, attacked it as corporate welfare, joined the political pressure surrounding it, and celebrated after Amazon abandoned the project, treating the cancellation as a victory over corporate power rather than as the disappearance of tens of thousands of promised jobs. Rubio reduced that entire ideological argument to arithmetic, because 25,000 jobs at an average salary of $150,000 represented approximately $375 billion in annual wages that would have gone to workers, families, landlords, stores, restaurants, contractors, schools, and businesses connected to that local economy. The contradiction was almost impossible to hide once the numbers were placed beside the rhetoric. The politician who had just declared herself the authentic defender of working people had helped stop one of the largest proposed job expansions in her region and then treated the outcome as proof of political courage. Rubio produced the image of the Job Creators Network billboard that had mocked AOC over the lost jobs, not because the billboard itself proved anything, but because it illustrated how quickly her Amazon victory had become a symbol of the gap between ideological celebration and economic consequence. Then he pointed to what happened in December 2019 when Amazon leased Manhattan office space for roughly 2,500 employees outside her district, and AOC publicly treated that later move as evidence that opposition to the original deal had somehow been vindicated. Rubio wrote the comparison in plain numbers, 25,000 versus 2,500, stripping away every slogan and leaving only the scale of the loss. 1,500 jobs represented just 6% of the original 25,000 job projection, meaning that even if someone wanted to call the later Manhattan lease a success, it still left roughly 94% of the original employment figure missing. AOC had transformed a fraction of the original proposal into a political victory lap, and Rubio's point was viciously simple. When a politician measures success by defeating the other side rather than by what workers actually gain, a massive loss can be rebranded as progress as long as the tweet sounds good. AOC pushed back by invoking the roughly $3.5 billion in incentives tied to the original Amazon deal, but Rubio answered by drawing the distinction between tax incentives associated with future economic activity and cash being handed over for nothing. Those jobs did not exist yet, which meant the future taxes, payroll, consumer spending, construction contracts, and business activity connected to them did not exist yet either, and that was the economic structure he accused her of ignoring. Rubio was not arguing that Amazon deserved worship or that every corporate incentive package was automatically wise. He was arguing that AOC had reduced a complicated development proposal to a moral slogan and then celebrated when the entire package collapsed. The political reward arrived instantly because attacking a giant corporation was easy, but the economic cost was carried by people who would never appear on a red carpet, never trend globally, and never receive millions of followers for explaining why losing a job opportunity hurt. That was the core of his indictment. Rhetoric had received the applause while ordinary workers absorbed the consequence. Rubio then personalized the cost through the example already in the source, a Dominican construction worker from Queens named David Reyes, a second-generation American who expected to work on the Amazon campus. The projected job would have paid around $100,000 with benefits and a pension, the kind of employment package that can transform a family's trajectory without requiring a politician to deliver a speech about transformation. After the project disappeared, Rubio said Reyes spent 8 months unemployed before finding work paying about $42,000 a year with no benefits and a 90-minute commute. That comparison did more damage than another 100 ideological arguments because it translated the Amazon fight from corporate subsidy language into the life of one worker who had expected a better job and ended up with less money, less security, and more time spent traveling to work. AOC had described her opposition as protection for working people, while Rubio presented Reyes as the working person standing on the other side of that protection, asking what exactly he had been protected from. Rubio then drove the argument into the worldview behind the policy dispute, contrasting AOC's hostility toward large private employers with the economic history his family had known in Cuba. He argued that governments can promise that corporations are unnecessary, that private enterprise is morally suspect, and that the state can carry economic responsibility instead. But slogans about fairness do not create wages simply because they sound virtuous. He pointed to Cuba's average monthly salary of roughly $30 in the version of the argument presented in the source, using that figure not as a detached academic comparison, but as a warning against turning economic suspicion into economic doctrine. His accusation was not subtle. AOC was fighting for a slogan and calling the slogan compassion, while the people who actually had to pay rent needed jobs, wages, benefits, transportation, and economic stability rather than ideological purity. The more she had tried to define Rubio as someone detached from working people, the more he turned her own record into evidence that political branding could become economically expensive for the very constituency being invoked to justify it. From there, Rubio moved to the Green New Deal, AOC's signature national policy project and one of the most recognizable pieces of legislation associated with her political rise. He listed the enormous scope attached to the proposal as presented in the source: eliminating fossil fuels on an accelerated timetable, retrofitting buildings nationwide, guaranteeing employment, expanding health and education commitments, and providing economic security at a scale that critics argued would require staggering federal resources. Rubio cited the American Action Forum estimate of roughly $93 trillion and immediately used the size of that number to puncture the distance between moral ambition and fiscal reality. He contrasted that estimate with AOC's previous argument that the resolution effectively cost zero because it was non-binding and represented a statement of values, exposing what he framed as the absurd convenience of describing a sweeping national transformation in maximalist terms and then treating the price tag as meaningless when questioned. His attack was not that values had no place in politics. It was that values become extremely cheap when someone else is expected to finance them. Then came the Senate vote, the kind of procedural fact that cut directly through the mythology surrounding the proposal. The Green New Deal received 0 votes in favor and 57 votes against, while Democrats largely voted present rather than attaching themselves directly to a proposal that had generated enormous publicity but far less legislative commitment. Rubio emphasized that not even AOC's own party had placed affirmative votes behind what had been sold nationally as a defining response to an existential crisis. A politician can command television coverage, social media loyalty, celebrity endorsements, magazine profiles, and endless commentary. But when the formal legislative system finally asks members to register a vote, popularity outside the chamber suddenly becomes irrelevant. Rubio was building toward a much larger accusation now. AOC had become extraordinarily effective at producing attention while remaining remarkably ineffective at converting attention into law. That was when he introduced the Center for Effective Lawmaking, the nonpartisan project associated with Vanderbilt University and the University of Virginia that ranked members of Congress based on legislative effectiveness. According to the ranking cited in the source, AOC stood 230th out of 240 House Democrats and last among the 19 Democrats from New York, a brutal number for a politician whose national fame vastly exceeded that of almost everyone ranked above her. Rubio paired the ranking with her legislative output, saying she had introduced 21 substantive bills while none received committee action, none reached a floor vote, and none became law. He contrasted that performance with Rashida Tlaib, another member of the squad, who ranked substantially higher and had managed to move legislation through committee, making it harder to blame AOC's weak ranking entirely on ideology or institutional hostility. Then, Rubio compressed the entire record into the contrast that would carry the next section of his attack. 13 million Twitter followers, 0 laws, an enormous digital audience attached to a legislative record that looked almost empty when measured by the institution she had actually been elected to serve in. Rubio did not stop with the legislative ranking because the deeper point was not simply that AOC had failed to move bills through Congress. It was that she had built a political identity around being unusually effective at representing ordinary people while the institutional record suggested something very different. AOC pushed back by saying, legislative effectiveness could not be measured by bills alone, but that answer opened exactly the door Rubio wanted, because if effectiveness was not going to be measured through legislation, then the obvious question was what standard she wanted to use instead. Tweets, Instagram stories, viral clips, magazine covers, television appearances, celebrity events, fundraising emails, and carefully staged moments could all create enormous political visibility, but none of them had the force of law, and none of them directly changed the federal code. Rubio sharpened the point by invoking the Met Gala, not as a random culture war distraction, but as the perfect visual symbol of the contradiction he had been building from the beginning. The woman who had presented herself as the uncompromising voice of the working class had walked into one of the most exclusive celebrity events in America wearing a political slogan across a designer dress and somehow expected the public to treat the image as rebellion rather than performance. The event was the September 2021 Met Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an environment filled with celebrities, wealthy donors, fashion executives, cultural elites, and people who lived in a financial universe almost completely inaccessible to the average family in AOC's district. Tickets were valued at roughly $35,000, a number so far removed from ordinary household budgeting that it represented more than many workers could save over years. Yet AOC appeared on the carpet wearing a white dress emblazoned with the words "Tax the Rich" in bright red lettering. Rubio did not need to mock the slogan itself because the setting had already done the work for him. An anti-wealth message displayed inside a gathering that symbolized concentrated wealth, status, exclusivity, and celebrity access. He described the dress as costing more than $1,000 and pointed to the designer's wealth, using those details to deepen the contrast between the message printed on the fabric and the world surrounding the person wearing it. The entire image, in Rubio's argument, functioned less like a protest against elite culture than like elite culture borrowing the visual language of protest for one evening. Then he focused on the image that had already circulated widely from the event, the one showing AOC moving through the gala without a mask while a masked woman behind her helped manage the train of the dress. That visual became devastating in the context of Rubio's broader accusation because it combined class, status, pandemic-era rules, and political symbolism in a single frame without requiring a complicated explanation. The elected official wearing "Tax the Rich" was the unmasked center of attention, while the worker assisting her remained masked, physically positioned behind her, holding the garment away from the floor. Rubio referenced criticism from Black Lives Matter Greater New York, emphasizing that the attack had not come only from conservatives or Republican activists, but also from people broadly aligned with progressive causes who described the moment as performative and inconsistent with socialist rhetoric. The significance was not that attending one expensive event automatically invalidated every political position AOC held, but that she had voluntarily created an image so perfectly aligned with the hypocrisy Rubio was alleging that almost no additional argument was necessary. Rubio then brought the numbers back into the room because numbers were doing far more damage than insults ever could. A Met Gala ticket cost roughly $35,000, while the median household income in the Bronx and Queens portion of AOC's district was cited at approximately $47,000, meaning one ticket represented around 3/4 of what an average household there earned in an entire year. That single comparison turned the glamour of the gala into an economic measurement of distance between representative and represented. Rubio argued that most of AOC's constituents could not casually enter that environment, could not afford the clothes, could not purchase the access, and certainly could not turn a night among celebrities into a national statement about solidarity with working families. She had written a protest message onto a dress at a party her constituents could scarcely imagine paying to attend, while telling the country that she remained the clearest expression of their economic frustration. AOC responded that she had attended as an invited guest of the Metropolitan Museum and that New York elected officials traditionally appeared at the event, but Rubio refused to let the defense change the argument. He said he was not criticizing her merely for attending a party, because attendance itself was not the contradiction he was targeting. The contradiction was preaching against wealthy elites while socializing inside one of their most exclusive spaces, lecturing the public about rules while service workers around her visibly operated under different conditions, and continuing to claim an uncomplicated working class identity while becoming increasingly comfortable inside the institutions of cultural celebrity. Rubio returned again to his mother, the hotel maid who made beds for wealthy guests, and contrasted that life with AOC writing political slogans onto dresses designed for events attended by wealthy guests. Those two things were not the same form of struggle, and Rubio made clear that he considered the attempt to place them under the same political language insulting to people whose labor had never been glamorous enough to become content. From there, he moved directly into campaign finance, another area where AOC had built a strong national brand by presenting herself as unusually clean, transparent, and independent from traditional money networks. Her public identity emphasized being people-funded, rejecting corporate PSE money, and demanding aggressive transparency from political figures whose financial relationships she believed deserved scrutiny. Rubio reminded the room that she had questioned Michael Cohen so aggressively about Donald Trump's finances that Vanity Fair had once described the performance as a financial colonoscopy, a phrase that captured how proudly her supporters had celebrated her willingness to dig through other people's disclosures. That standard mattered now because Rubio was about to apply it back to her own operation. If financial transparency was supposed to be a weapon against hypocrisy, then there was no defensible reason for that weapon to become suddenly inappropriate when the documents belonged to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Rubio introduced the role of Saikat Chakrabarti, AOC's former campaign manager and chief of staff, and the organizations connected to Brand New Congress. According to the source, roughly $1 million moved through Brand New Congress and a related political action committee into companies controlled by Chakrabarti, prompting a formal complaint to the Federal Election Commission from the National Legal and Policy Center. The complaint alleged that the structure had been used to avoid the disclosure rules AOC publicly championed, turning what had been marketed as a new model of clean grassroots politics into a financial arrangement complicated enough to draw federal scrutiny. Chakrabarti left AOC's office in August 2019 during the period of controversy, a timing Rubio used to reinforce the sense that the political movement built around transparency had become far less comfortable once transparency began moving inward. Rubio did not need to prove criminal intent in the hearing room. His purpose was to show that the politician who had made financial purity part of her personal brand had a campaign network complicated enough to generate the exact kind of questions she demanded others answer. Then, Rubio raised the more recent campaign payments described in the source, approximately $18,125 paid to psychiatrist Dr. Brian Bowl, and classified in the campaign filings as leadership training and consulting. He carefully avoided commenting on anyone's personal health and instead kept the argument focused on campaign finance law, emphasizing that federal campaign funds could not legally be converted into personal spending merely by attaching a professional-sounding label to the payment. The issue, as he framed it, was brutally straightforward. If the services were legitimately campaign-related consulting, then the documentation should support that classification. But if they were personal services disguised as campaign expenses, then the filings would raise a serious legal problem. AOC answered that the complaints had been filed by partisan organizations. But Rubio immediately cut through that defense by pointing out that the underlying payments and disclosures had not been invented by the complainants. The organizations filing the complaints could be attacked for motive all day long, but the numbers they were reading came from AOC's own filings, and once again the documents were proving far harder to dismiss than the people holding them. Rubio closed the folder after that because the documentary phase of the confrontation was finished, and what remained was the part that gave every number, ranking, filing, and photograph its emotional weight. He placed both hands on the table and returned to the point AOC had chosen at the beginning: family, authenticity, struggle, and the American dream. His father had stood behind a bar for 3 decades without building a political movement around the humiliation of service work, and his mother had cleaned hotel rooms without turning hardship into a personal brand. They had worked, saved, sacrificed, and told their children that America could offer them opportunities their parents had never possessed. Then Rubio reached into his jacket and pulled out the worn photograph he had been carrying, the photograph that would turn the entire exchange from a political argument into a visual contrast AOC could no longer answer with another slogan. Rubio unfolded the worn photograph and held it where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could see it, not toward the cameras, not toward the reporters, and not toward the gallery searching for another viral moment, but directly toward the person who had accused his family story of being political branding. The picture showed his parents on the day they became American citizens, his father wearing the only suit he owned, his mother wearing a dress she had made herself, both standing outside the federal courthouse in Miami with the expression of people who had reached something they had spent years working toward. Rubio described that image as the American dream in its most basic form: 2 immigrants arriving with little, working ordinary jobs for decades, sacrificing quietly, and giving their children opportunities they themselves had never possessed. There was no designer slogan in the photograph, no celebrity carpet, no social media campaign, no carefully engineered identity attached to the scene. Only a bartender and a hotel maid standing on courthouse steps after becoming citizens of the country they had chosen. Then Rubio set the photograph down beside the folder and returned to AOC's record because the contrast between the photograph and the political brand she had built was now impossible to separate. He reminded the room that AOC had told America she was from the Bronx, while leaving the Bronx at 5 and spending most of her childhood in Yorktown Heights, a wealthy Westchester community far removed from the image repeatedly attached to her political persona. He reminded them that she had claimed to be the uncompromising defender of working people while fighting the Amazon project associated with 25,000 jobs, and then celebrating after those jobs disappeared from the original plan. He reminded them that the Green New Deal had become the centerpiece of her national legislative identity while receiving 0 affirmative votes in the Senate, and while her own legislative effectiveness ranking placed her near the bottom of House Democrats. He reminded them that she had appeared at a 35,000 per ticket Met Gala wearing Tax the Rich, while service workers around her remained visually separated from the celebrity world she had entered. And he reminded them that the campaign operation built around transparency had become the subject of complaints after complicated financial transfers and nearly $19,000 in payments classified as leadership training and consulting. Rubio then returned to the accusation that had started everything, the claim that his family story was branding, and answered it with the accumulated weight of every document, number, photograph, and contradiction he had placed into the record. His father really had spent decades tending bar. His mother really had cleaned hotel rooms. His parents really had stood outside a courthouse after becoming American citizens. And the photograph on the table existed whether anyone approved of Rubio's politics or not. By contrast, he argued, AOC's public identity began with the Bronx, but became far less simple when Yorktown Heights entered the picture, began with working class rhetoric but became harder to defend after the Amazon fight, and began with financial purity but ended with campaign finance complaints. Rubio's point was deliberately ruthless because he was no longer debating ideology. He was arguing that one life had been lived before it became politically useful, while the other had been arranged into a political product after the useful pieces had been selected. He closed with the accusation that his parents had earned their American dream while AOC had manufactured hers, and the room went quiet enough for the silence itself to become part of the confrontation. AOC sat almost motionless as Rubio delivered the final line about boasting about the Bronx while lacking the truth, and for several seconds there was no meaningful response from the Democratic side of the dais. Her chief of staff leaned toward her and whispered something, after which AOC requested a brief recess from the chairman, a request that instantly became more damaging than almost anything she could have said in rebuttal. Rubio simply gathered his folder and the photograph, stated that he had nothing further and believed the record spoke for itself, then left without adding another round of insults or trying to extend the spectacle. AOC did not receive the reset she appeared to be seeking. Instead, cameras captured the request itself, producing the kind of short, devastating visual that social media can separate from an hour of context and circulate endlessly. The confrontation that had begun with AOC expecting footage of Rubio under pressure ended with viewers watching her ask for the room to stop. Within minutes, clips spread across social platforms, but the image that traveled fastest was Rubio holding the faded citizenship photograph while talking about his parents and their American dream. Within 48 hours, according to the source narrative, the hearing had accumulated roughly 90 million views across platforms, while Sandy from Westchester trended globally for 4 days, and the contrast between Rubio's parents' photograph and AOC's Met Gala appearance became a recurring meme. AOC's office released a statement describing the hearing as a coordinated effort to silence a woman of color fighting for working families. But the statement did not directly answer the Yorktown history, the Amazon jobs, the legislative ranking, or the campaign finance complaints Rubio had placed before the committee. She followed with a 47-minute Instagram live that was emotional, defensive, and designed to rally the audience that had supported her for years. Her base responded, but the source emphasizes that independent voters, moderate Democrats, older voters, and Latino voters in her district reacted differently because they watched the underlying hearing instead of simply accepting the counterattack. Media coverage hardened the perception that the hearing had become a documentary cross-examination rather than an ordinary partisan shouting match. Jake Tapper was described as calling it cross-examination in its purest sense because Rubio had relied on public records, AOC's disclosures, and a nonpartisan academic ranking rather than anonymous accusations. The New York Times was described as publishing a moderate Democratic opinion piece focused on the squad's branding problem, while Vanity Fair, which had previously praised AOC's Met Gala moment, published an uncomfortable examination of authenticity in progressive politics. The central problem for AOC was no longer merely that a Republican official had attacked her. It was that the attack had been organized around materials that could be read, counted, photographed, and replayed without Rubio needing to supply much additional interpretation. Once the spectacle faded, the documents remained. According to the original narrative, the political damage soon moved beyond headlines as the FEC opened a formal review of the brand new Congress PC transfers, Saikat Chakrabarty's financial records were subpoenaed, and the psychiatrist payments triggered a separate congressional inquiry into their classification. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division was also described as quietly reviewing whether campaign money allegedly used for personal expenses could create tax consequences, while campaign staff faced questions about whether personal spending had been presented as campaign consulting. House Democratic leadership responded cautiously, with Hakeem Jeffries saying every member was responsible for their own filings and that he trusted the oversight process, language that offered AOC no political rescue. Squad allies issued supportive statements, but the source portrays those statements as shorter, more careful, and more legally restrained than the aggressive defenses that had surrounded earlier controversies. The protective political wall around AOC was no longer portrayed as solid because institutional allies appeared increasingly unwilling to attach themselves directly to the financial questions. The source then describes AOC's district polling falling sharply, including an 18-point overall approval decline, a 26-point decline among voters over 40, and a 14-point decline among Latino voters in the district. For the first time since her 2018 upset, a serious challenger named Maria Santos entered the NY14 primary race with significant money and attention, presenting herself as a Bronx community organizer who had been born there, raised there, and continued to live there. Santos's announcement video directly exploited the authenticity argument that Rubio had opened, showing her walking Bronx streets and speaking with residents while declaring that she did not need to pretend to be from the community because she had never left it. The video reportedly reached 20 million views in 1 week and helped generate $3.8 million in small dollar donations during the first month, an extraordinary launch for a primary challenger against one of America's most recognizable members of Congress. What had begun as Rubio exposing contradictions inside a hearing room had now become the central vulnerability in an actual election campaign. 4 months after the hearing, the source narrative says the FEC found reason to believe campaign finance violations had occurred in the brand new Congress structure, while AOC's campaign agreed to pay a $187,000 fine, and the psychiatrist payments were reclassified as personal expenses and reimbursed. Chakrabarty declined comment through an attorney, and the primary campaign moved toward September with Santos using local identity and political effectiveness against AOC's celebrity brand. Santos ultimately defeated Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by 11 points, then delivered a victory message arguing that the Bronx did not need a brand but needed a representative, deliberately turning Rubio's central accusation into the defining language of the campaign. AOC conceded, congratulated Santos, avoided revisiting the hearing or the FEC findings, and announced that she would explore work in media and advocacy. Within 3 months, according to the source, she signed a multi-year agreement with a progressive streaming platform, transforming Rubio's earlier attack about being a content creator with millions of followers and no laws into the final irony of her political exit. The source closes by describing the Chakrabarti matter being referred to the Department of Justice for potential criminal violations, while emphasizing that AOC herself was not personally charged, though she was identified as a beneficiary in referral documents and the investigation remained unresolved. Rubio refused to celebrate her defeat publicly, later telling a reporter that he had said what he needed to say in the hearing room and that New York voters had said the rest. He returned once more to the American dream, arguing that it works only when people earn it honestly, build a record instead of a brand, and remain capable of showing the work when somebody eventually demands proof. Back in the Bronx, David Reyes watched Maria Santos win while remembering the Amazon job he believed he had lost, looking at a life in which he still worked 60 hours a week for far less money than the original opportunity had promised. The entire confrontation ended where Rubio had begun it, with the argument that working people can recognize the difference between somebody who lived the struggle and somebody who turned the language of struggle into performance, because receipts eventually reach places rhetoric cannot protect.